Segment 4, economics, a brief history of the profession. Mike, I'm going to quote you. This is you writing in 2008, shortly after Barack Obama defeated John McCain. Quote, quoting Michael Boskin, "Those of us who supported the other guy hope Mr. Obama succeeds." Very gracious. And now here's something even more gracious. "We like his top economic appointments." Close quote. Oh?
Yeah, I think they're capable economists. However, it turns out what seems to have happened in the Obama administration is that all the calls have been political, and there's been very little sound economics.
Okay, so here's what President Obama is chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. Your successor and your successor, Christina Romer, doctorate from MIT, taught at Princeton and Berkeley, director of President Obama's National Economic Council, Larry Summers, former president of Harvard University. These are serious people. What are they thinking?
Well, I would say, I don't want to criticize the people who are in office right now. I think they're trying to do the best they can. This is, as we all know, these are not easy jobs. I think they have a different view of the economy than Mike and I probably do. Larry is a terrific economist. He's a great person, and I think someone who is trying to help the economy, but to my point of view, well, in other words, I'm going to tell you.
Go ahead.
From my point of view, I think he believes in Keynesian economics much more than I do. I think he believes that the stimulus works to a much greater extent than I do. Unfortunately, the stimulus doesn't work in large part, not only because the multiplier might be below 1, but also because it's very difficult to get the money out there. We learned that. I learned that directly from the tax rebates that we did in 2008. When we did those tax rebates, and by the way, the tax rebates are somewhat different from the stimulus because the tax rebates at least give the money back to the people. It's not additional spending,
right,
government spending. So there is a bit of a distinction there. But still, I have to confess in retrospect that when I look back at the evidence from that tax rebate, it was really underwhelming. The reality is we spent about $150 billion. We figure we got maybe a third to a half of that out into the economy over the first 6 months, and it had really very limited effects on economic growth. I think the same has been true during the Obama administration. Unfortunately, they didn't learn the lesson, I think, that they could have gotten from us. But they believe in what they're doing. I simply don't believe that it works.
Here, Mike, you spoke earlier about the 70s versus the 80s. Again, a layman's question. 1980s, you have in this country smaller government, lower taxes, less regulation, restrained, consistent monetary policy, growth. At the same time that central planning is bringing Russia and Eastern Europe into collapse. I had sort of thought that between Milton Friedman and George Stigler and Gary Beckler on the intellectual side and the actual lived experience of the 1980s and 1990s, your profession, economics, had gotten someplace. Conclusions had been reached. Now, am I simply mistaken about that? Did the Keynesian big government spending stimulus model simply continue? Did it just kind of go underground for a while and now it has sprung back forth? Is it considered still a coherent alternative model to free markets? Well, describe the intellectual landscape.
There is something called the new Keynesian view. If we go back intellectually, Milton Friedman and Franco Modigliani at Chicago and MIT at the time both geared people to longer-term time horizons. Bob Lucas geared us toward people's expectations of future events. And the supply-siders, myself and Feldstein academically, some others on a more popular basis, geared us toward incentives. And those things got incorporated into mainstream macroeconomics. But there was always, so the new Keynesians started to take a look at what happened when you did some of this, but you still had what they thought of as very sticky prices and wages, so the economy could get stuck and you might need a more activist government. So that's kind of been the on the intellectual side. But the leading new Keynesian theorist, Michael Woodford at Columbia, in his paper that he just gave in Atlanta in 2010, says that he can only get the multiplier up to 1 in extreme cases when the Fed's at 0 interest rates and we're expected to stay there for the duration of when the spending is done. So I think intellectually it's kind of broken down. However, there is this political urge to do something, and that's very powerful. And I myself and most economists believe there's some short run where in an extreme environment Keynesian economics has some partial validity, but it's not large multipliers, but there's a very short time period.
So when it comes down to it, again, the layman's question, I watched the Obama administration clearly there are intense political pressures. Clearly Nancy Pelosi and Henry Waxman and the liberals who have ascended to the chairmanship of important committees in the House had a huge, but then there's Larry Summers and there's Christina. So overwhelmingly it's politics. And you with your deep bow of professional courtesy to these folks, but what's really going on is they're trying to impose on what is essentially a political set of events some intellectual coherence and some is that right?
I think that's a little too strong. I would say that
you do too?
I think they partially agree.
Okay.
Yeah. And then it gets exaggerated in the political process.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the economics profession, despite the evidence that we have from macroeconomics over the past 30 to 40 years, decided in 2008 that we were going to believe the Keynesian model because we needed something to work. I think it was more hope than it was based on evidence. But unfortunately, that was what was going on not only in the administration, I think that was going on throughout most of the economics profession, and I hear it constantly. When I watch the business press, business news, many very distinguished economists will talk about the effect of the stimulus, how the economy has rebounded not only in the United States but in Europe in large part because of government action. China is another case in point. I just don't believe it. I don't think the evidence supports it.
Let me give you the best example of this, how outrageously exaggerated this is. President Obama often says something almost exactly like the following. It's largely because of the stimulus bill that we avoided a second Great Depression.
Right.
Okay. If you go back to Christy Romer and Jared Bernstein's analysis of the stimulus, they said for 3 quarters or so we were going to have 1 percentage point lower unemployment because of the stimulus. Okay. Now they thought it would top out at 8 rather than 9, and it actually got up to 10. So maybe it would have gone up to 11. But in any event, so that's nothing like. So their own estimate of the effect of it was tiny compared to this kind of effusive statement by the president and by many people in the political process. So that's what I mean by it gets exaggerated as it's told, and then it got kind of distorted in the political process to something that might have been somewhat effective, something that was fairly ineffective.